And I think that we are live. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Everybody, we're live?
Live to tape.
Live to tape. Okay. I was like, man, now I got to go hold their face. Anyways, guys, welcome back. It's another edition of the insurance panel. This is going to be a great one. We kind of gave you spurts what this is going to be about. This video will probably be released in a few days from now. We got some editing to do. Nick has been super awesome on editing, so everybody thank him for that. He takes more than enough time to do that. But today's going to be a very special one. We have somebody that is a non-practicing funeral director. He was a funeral director before. He's done the pre-need side of things. Ooh, that's a big topic. And now he's practicing final expense. So it's very rare to have the holy trinity of funerals in one person. But he's here. Kevin Mason, welcome to the insurance panel. And introduce yourself, man. Tell us what you're all about.
Sure. Well, my name is Kevin Mason, and I'm a final expense agent here in Ohio, and I do business also in Michigan. And I've been doing it for a couple years full time, and just happy to be part of a successful organization that is very proactive and aggressive in their final expense business.
Yeah. Well, you can't have a final expense, a successful final expense organization without successful final expense agents like yourself. So you're a big testament to whatever organization you're with, and that's fantastic. I'm sure they're happy to have you. Always joining us, we got Nick Frumpkin. I think you already said hey. I introduced him.
Hi.
There he is. No dog this week. Sorry, guys.
No dog this week.
And then, of course, we've got Chris in the group. Chris, how was your week this week? Did you put up some rookie numbers this time?
Absolute rookie numbers.
Good, man. Well, let's jump right
numbers.
Entry level numbers. Let's get right into it. I know we don't have Kevin for too long, but I'm very excited about this because there's not a lot of people that want to talk about it. Most don't know Security National Life actually has a whole pre-need division, and it's like a whole nother world. It's like a totally different entity than the final expense market. They don't like us, we don't like them, right? And it's just two different worlds. So I'm really, really excited to have Kevin to kind of clear some stuff up for us, give us some advice on things that we need to know, especially if you're in final expense, things that you may not know that you can bring into a house that'll help you sell more final expense. So I know we had some questions we posted up in a life insurance group. Nick took the time to do that. We got a lot of questions. A lot of people are very eager to hear what you have to say. So, Nick, I'm going to defer these questions to you because you have a better reading voice than I do. What do you got?
And I want to take a minute. Feel like I've known Kevin for a while, and I feel like he undersold how good of a final expense agent he is a little bit. He's qualified for a few carrier trips right now. And you know that if you've been watching the channel, you know that that's the thing that we consider the most valuable judge of how good an agent you are is have you made carrier trips, and are you placing business that sticks and gets you to going where you're going. He's quite good at selling final expense, so he knows what he's talking about from the final expense agent side. We do have a bunch of questions. I'm going to kind of go through them one at a time, but there are things that I think everybody can talk about. I mean, Kevin's obviously got the expertise, but I think there's something for everybody on the panel to kind of weigh in and lead a little bit. So we got a couple of questions from, people with names. Shoot. Dennis Han Villamar. Sorry, Dennis. If insureds move to another state and transfer their policies, will the new funeral home honor the cost of the current policy? Before we throw it to Kevin, I'm just curious if anybody else on the panel knows the answer to that, because I'm positive Kevin knows. But Chris, Matt, I mean, if somebody asked you that in the home, would you know what to say?
No, I know that most of the funeral homes are owned by a few large corporations, so I would suspect that it probably is transferable, and that wouldn't be the avenue I would look to approach it at, because I think that wouldn't be an honest way to look at it. I suspect they are transferable.
Okay.
I think they are transferable as well. What about you, Kevin?
Well, the answer is, drum roll please. The answer is that they actually don't have to be. All it is a pile of money, is all it is. See, what happens is when you do a pre-arrangement with the funeral home, they have their certain prices, okay? And other than the outside expenses of, opening, closing the cemetery, paying the minister flowers, the kind of third-party things that happen on a funeral contract, all the services and merchandise, so casket, vault, picking up the deceased at the place of death, bringing them back to the funeral home, embalming, funeral service, visitation, all that stuff is guaranteed by the funeral home. Once you, say, move to Florida and want to take your pre-arrangement with you, technically that funeral home does not have to take it to honor your prices. However, they almost always undoubtedly will, because it's business for them. And so they're not going to turn down a family. But legally they don't have to, but they probably will. So that's pretty much how that works. So they don't have to, but they probably will.
So how likely is it that somebody would do something like they take their contracts to another funeral home out of state, and the funeral home says, we'll totally take that contract, but we can't honor that price anymore. We have to charge you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 more.
That certainly could happen on some things, and some things they would be right to do. So for instance, let's say they prearranged a cemetery plot at the little country cemetery that's opening closing is $300, and they want to come to Nashville, where almost all funeral homes and cemeteries are corporately owned, actually. So their prices are way higher. So therefore, they would probably have to pay a difference because the difference is so high. One thing I will say, though, of what Chris mentioned, I don't know the exact numbers now, but when a handful of years ago, the funeral home market really is only corporately owned. The last numbers I saw, which it was a little bit ago, it was about 23%. So it's not that the corporates, own a majority actually, but what you do see is more consolidation within family-owned funeral homes. So you'll see funerals just buying family-owned funeral homes buying up smaller locations. So they're running little 80 call firms, but they have 3 or 4 or 5 of them instead of having one location that does 300 or 400. So there's a consolidation within the business, but it's not necessarily corporate.
Interesting.
I feel like I just had a question come to mind, and hopefully you can for us, because I know it came up on the internet before. From the moment you pick up a deceased, be it at the home, the hospital, or anywhere, how long in the states you've been licensed in can you hold a body before you have to disposition it?
Well, I can only speak in the state of Ohio, but in the state of Ohio, funeral directors have what they call a temporary, get their wording right, I have the temporary right of disposition, meaning that I can only hold a body for, and they don't even define it because, it's a little wiggly, but a reasonable time before you can dispose. But I can't, in other words, I can't, as a funeral director, I cannot hold a body for ransom. So legally, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but legally I can't hold a body and say, hey, we're going to hold Bill, your husband, until we get paid. That's illegal. And I don't think that happens very often, but sometimes what may happen more often is you have a situation where they're having a little bit of trouble coming up with some of the money, so you get sort of half down. You go ahead and bury the person anyway, or cremate or whatever, but then that back half of the money, as a funeral home, you're responsible for and you have to collect. And if you don't, you're kind of, there's no recourse other than sending the people to collections, which most funeral homes will not do, just because it just, it's not good for PR. So they usually just eat the cost. In the FE business, I would say the funeral home is definitely our adversary, but being a funeral director for 20 years, I will say that funeral homes eat more business than you could ever imagine. Because that's why it's easy to paint corporate, and I managed a corporate funeral home for a number of years. And I'm not so much being defensive to them, but I would say corporately owned funeral homes take some of, they take some criticism that I would say is not necessarily accurate, because they say, oh, corporately owned funeral homes, they want all their money up front and this and that and this and that. I tell you what, there's some family-owned funeral homes that are that way too, because they gave away funerals for so long because they did it on a handshake, and oh yeah, 30-day terms, and you could do that 20, 25 years ago. There's no way you can do that anymore. So I've actually seen funeral homes where they were offered their own credit card. It's called Serenity Care. I don't know if it's still in business, but it used to be, where it's just like going to Macy's and you apply for a store card, except it's a store card at a funeral home. And so it's that bad. So accounts receivable has never been worse in the funeral business, unfortunately.
That's interesting.
So I think the question is, say somebody comes, you get a call from the field, from someone's house, and say, hey, Sally's died, can you come pick her up? I've given those calls as a paramedic before, so I know there isn't any pre-qualification that's done. They're like, what's the address? We'll be there in about an hour.
Right.
Two guys come out, they pick her up in a scoop stretcher, and they carry her out. The next day, the family comes into the funeral home, and you find out they've got zilch, zero source of income, zero insurance. And my understanding is you'll probably talk them into alternatives, like let's talk direct cremation, let's talk a small 1-hour gathering.
Yes.
And what I'm starting to hear more and more, which is interesting insight, is when all else fails, you'll eat the rest of the cost and take what you can take, because you don't want your name in the community being the one that, held up the funeral for 2 weeks for $2,000.
Correct. That's exactly right. So what I would say is, this isn't something I would necessarily advertise to your prospects, but in the state of Ohio, it used to be that the state of Ohio would allocate X amount of dollars towards a funeral, and they would actually help dispose of the deceased. Then they stopped doing that in November of 01 maybe, and then it went to the individual municipalities. And so every city or municipality took that responsibility. Unfortunately, most cities have not allocated for that and budgeted for that. So when you apply for that, they don't know what you're talking about. So this idea that the county buries you or the state buries you, it could vary between states, but generally they're not really willing to do that anymore. You used to have the paupers' graves and things. Most municipalities just aren't able to do that with shrinking budgets and such. So I would say that usually the funeral home takes the brunt, and so you're quite right. They would assume what I did was, hey, how much money can you come up with? Is what I would say. And you'd be surprised what people can do when they have to. And so usually they could get $500-600 together, and I would get that up front, and I would do the cremation, and if I could get more than that, then I would. But usually a cremation in Ohio for a family-owned funeral home it can vary, but probably 2,000 is a good round number, and I would try to get as much as I could. I'd probably do it'd be 2,000. Let's say I do the contract, I do a goodwill discount of 1,500, and I'd get as much up front as I could and send them bills for the rest. And if I didn't see anything else, then I wrote off the difference, but at least I got, my bills paid for at least.
Interesting.
You'd
Next
mentioned,
question. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, you'd mentioned that the corporate funeral homes aren't always the ones that are causing the problems. And I was going to relate that I had an experience with that recently, where I had a client whose husband passed away, and she went to go file her death claim, and for reasons, she had to have a long investigation into the cause of his death, having to do with VA benefits and trying to make sure that his death was deemed related to Agent Orange exposure,
Right.
which delayed the issuing of the death certificate by about 3 months.
Yep.
And the funeral home threw a fit, and it was a completely independent mom and pop funeral home, little community-based one, who I worked with before, always seemed to be really nice. But he did the cremation in advance because he knew that she had life insurance. And then when he found out that she didn't have the death certificate and that he wasn't going to get paid for who knew how long, he threw a temper tantrum is like the best way I can describe it.
Right.
He called me up and let me have it. Like, how dare I not have her just buy a $3,000 pre-need plan? She has the money. Why don't you just let her give me the money? And so it was interesting that that's coming. And that's probably why, from what you were saying, where they're running on smaller margins and they don't have the.
Well, right. And that's exactly right. And with the cremation rate, I mean, when I did pre-need in Columbus, I wrote for a very big firm there. And just in Columbus alone, at the time, you'd have usually the more, we don't run into this much, I realize, but the more affluent the area, usually the higher the cremation rate. So, for instance, Worthington, Ohio, is the average education is a master's degree. So at that time, the cremation rate was about 40%. Whereas if you go to more of Grove City, which is the very southern part of Columbus, is much more rural, kind of get her done. You've got a cremation rate of about 10% at the time. Now, all those that was 20 years ago. So the cremation rate is way higher, and it's probably 70 and 30 now. So that's where it's going. So they just have to make up their, expenses other ways, and they just can't wait for the money anymore. That's the sad reality.
Yeah, it's too bad. All right, so you were about to say, Matt, it's time to move on to the next question.
Yep.
Okay. Still sticking with Dennis. He also said he would like to know the pros and cons of a final expense policy versus a pre-need policy, and what's the best way as a final expense agent to persuade a prospect that final expense is a better choice for them than pre-need, which I think is really interesting as a question in several ways, but I'll hold my thoughts until after you guys have talked a little bit. But again, I think I'd like to hear what Matt and Chris have to say before we throw it to Kevin, just to kind of get
Sure.
multiple perspectives.
From what I understand, the average premium for a pre-need is about $100 to $120, where the average premium dollar for a final expense client is between $50 and $60, right? So you're dealing with almost a double the premium, which is a lot more cost on the client. So you're dealing with a different market. But it's just, from what I understand, pre-need is a great thing because most final expense agents don't understand what it really takes to take care of a funeral. Most FE agents go, oh, well, you can get a funeral done for X amount, so this is all the coverage you need, when in reality it costs a whole lot more. But I would say if you really understand the cost of a funeral, the premium dollar is going to be a whole lot less for a final expense client than a pre-need client.
I've kind of seen two different ones, and I don't want to get my terms mixed up, so I'll try not to mix them up. I've seen the ones where somebody will finance the cost of a funeral, and it literally looks like a car financing contract. It's like this long, and they spent, $45 a month times 48 months with 10% interest to buy their niche. Then I've also seen, the homesteaders and the National Guardian Life 7 pays that I think are what we refer to as pre-needs. And in those situations, what I'll try to do is I'll match it up with like a Transamerica 10 pay and see if they're competitive. I'll see if, dollar per dollar, if there's any way to navigate it, and just see if there's an ethical way to improve their situation and kind of approach it from that angle. And I know that maybe my understanding is that like a pre-need agreement might come in great use for a far younger client that can't qualify for any final expense product, or maybe someone who's waited a little bit too long and can afford, a 5 or 7 or a 3 pay. But I don't have that much of a knowledge on the topic. That's about as much as I know.
So before we throw it to Kevin, I'm going to say I don't know that this is something that final expense agents should ever really have to worry about coming up against, unless somebody's already got a pre-need in place.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that while I have had clients tell me that they were thinking about going down to the funeral home to get a pre-need plan, I don't know any of them that have actually followed through on that. And I don't think the average final expense client really genuinely has the option of going and pre-planning their funeral at the funeral home, just due to cost, as is my understanding. If they were going to, they would have done that, and they wouldn't have sent a lead card back to me, and I wouldn't be sitting with them. So I don't worry about needing to convince somebody that final expense is better than pre-need, because they wouldn't have sent back a final expense lead. If pre-need was really a viable option, it's about as viable an option as donating their body to science. It's a different story if somebody actually already has a pre-need plan in place. But that's kind of my feeling on it. What do you think, Kevin?
I would say that actually, really, what all you have said, all three of you, has been actually pretty accurate. I would just add to it a little bit. One, I would say that most people that are contemplating a pre-need, a pre-need is a good idea if you can pay cash. You know, if it's a $12,000 funeral, which I would say would be about an average in Ohio. I know the NFDA says, 7,000, 8,000, whatever it is, but that doesn't include a vault. It doesn't include outside expenses, opening, closing, all the things we talked about earlier. So really 10 to 12 is actually a much more accurate out-of-pocket expense, out the door, as it were. But what I would say is most people, I'll tell them, I'll say, look, if they say, well, I'm thinking about doing, pre-arrangement, okay, I'm not argumentative with them. I would say, oh yeah, pre-arrangement, can be certainly a good idea. Are you paying cash for that? And then of course they're not, because they're a final expense client. And so then I just turn it around and I just say, oh, well, there's only a couple ways that pre-arrangement's a good idea. One is if you can pay cash, and that is a good idea. But if you can't, and you need to do it over monthly installments, just to give you an example, on a $12,000 funeral, if you do that on a 3-pay, it's going to cost you about $14,000 over the 3 years. Okay, these are just round numbers. I mean, different companies can be different. But basically, you're paying a premium of about $390. A 5-pay, you're going to pay in about $18,000, and you're paying $300 a month. And over 10 years, you're going to pay $24,000 over a 10-pay, $200 a month for a $12,000 funeral. And when you run the numbers, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, even though, okay, so you locked in the cost, quote unquote, but you're paying substantially more over time, and it's just generally not in their best interest. And so again, I don't want to poo-poo the idea of pre-arrangement, because they've already decided pre-arrangement's a good idea. But what I will say is there's something called a non-funded pre-arrangement. It's very simple, and you can get booklets from Homesteaders and all these other companies that are called family memorial guides, and they can record their family wishes in it, and it doesn't cost them a dime. And then just simply say, all of the arrangements that you want to tell the funeral home, they're in this booklet. That's fine. And that's a way for you to communicate to the funeral home post-mortem, okay? But the financing end of the funeral, you don't really want to do it the way you're wanting to, because you're going to spend so much more to do it. And a final expense policy, not only will it take care of the funeral, but it's going to take care of all of the final expenses. I mean, that's the business that we're in. We need, as final expense agents, we need to communicate with them that not only are you going to have the funeral costs, but you're going to have final expenses of, you're not buying cemetery property typically off the funeral home, right? Unless they have a cemetery, a funeral home on the grounds. So that's an added expense. And, maybe paying for family to drive in, or paying your taxes in arrears from property, if they own the property, all the things that creep up that we sort of forget about. It's our job to educate our prospects. So
yeah, here's a question I have, and I feel it's so much a question. I guess a twofold question is, one, some don't realize that in certain states, you have to have a funeral director license to do pre-need. In the state of South
Correct.
Carolina, you have to have a funeral director license, but in the state of Georgia, you don't. So it's totally different. So my company, we don't really focus on pre-need in South Carolina, but in Georgia, it's awesome, right? And it's because of licenses. Here's another thing I have. The pre-need guys, they don't. How do they prospect? Because do y'all send in lead cards? What do you do? Because a final expense agent, as you know, we send out lead cards. They get them filled out, and we go and see the people. But from what my understanding is it's just canvassing, building relationships, and things like that to prospect for pre-need. Is that correct?
Right. There's a lot of different lead sources. I've done primarily direct mail over the 5 years I did it. It's usually a little bit more of a qualified lead. Our final expense direct mail leads are decently qualified.
Sure.
But I used to run, I forget how many leads now. It's been forever. But it's a completely different animal. It's a completely different clientele, as you well know. So I did it in my 20s, and I'm thinking I'm walking out of houses with, checks for $12,000 and $18,000, and it just, or doing monthly payment plans that just, it blows my mind that they would trust a 22-year-old to do that. But I guess you have to be professional. But I would say that primarily direct mail. Then they run what they call heritage files, which means you go back in the files and you will mail, with a personalized letter and everything, the last families that you served over the last 12 months, and just do a pre-approach letter. And we have a widget that we're going to bring out to you, just to just check on you, or and it just sort of a way to get your foot in the door. Actually, proactive pre-need plans actually do that usually 30 to 60 days after the funeral, where the point isn't to do a pre-need right then, but it's just to introduce, and hey, I'm Kevin, I'm the aftercare coordinator. That's what aftercare is. Aftercare is code for pre-need, if we're following along in our chart here. So you just stop by the house. A funny story about that, my grandpa, when my grandmother died, I was doing pre-need at the time, and my grandpa said, some guy from the funeral home came by about a month after we buried your grandmother, it's probably one of you pre-need guys, he was just, he was a get off my lawn guy, but that's where I get it, I guess. But that's really where it starts with a lot of companies and family-owned funeral homes, because these small family-owned funerals, they can't run an aftercare program. Not that they can't, but they don't know the first thing to do it and the first thing about it. So they generally will hire a third-party marketer, which is what I did. And I came into an area and I would write for multiple funeral homes. They didn't compete against each other, but I would just do direct mail, and then maybe do a heritage file where I would, go through the files and, hey, call them up, and even, try to meet with them and drop off some goodies. So many different ways to do it, but I think direct mail is the best way.
I got two good questions for you as we're getting close to the 30-minute mark here. How often would a funeral home accept a contestable claim, contestable policy? And can you explain a little bit about what an assignment company is? Because one of the big captive companies pushes that they pay claims within 24 hours. And I'm of the understanding, and I could be wrong, that it doesn't matter how long it takes to get paid, because you take assignment of the policy, the assignment company fronts the money, and then they get it when they get it. So paying claims quickly is almost unnecessary if it's a non-contestable claim.
Right. So for a company that will remain nameless that I worked for, they did that. They did I think they may have even owned the company, where they would take, they charge for assignments, basically. So people had a life insurance policy, they would assign it to the funeral home. And then, so I'll give you an example, for people that don't know. So if the funeral is $10,000 and it's a $20,000 policy, the beneficiary would come in, make funeral arrangements. assign the policy to the funeral home for just the funeral amount only. So the funeral home would get a $10,000 check, the beneficiary would receive a $10,000 check.
Mhm.
That's generally how it works. You're quite right. There are third-party companies that basically, it's almost kind of it's not a viatical relationship, but it's where they will pay you and then collect later, but they take a fee, which can be, it's a percentage of the face amount of the policy.
Isn't that called fast funding?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's names for it. I haven't dealt with it for quite a while, but
Sure.
but what I would say is it's really a ripoff because it's a percentage of what the face amount is. So if you have a decent amount of insurance, they don't go on the funeral price; they go on the face amount of the policy.
Right.
So that can add up quite a bit. As a funeral home and as a funeral director, um, you have to be careful when you receive policies, and depending who you work for. So I'll give you an example. The company that I work for, the Darth Vader of the funeral industry, what they would do is basically, I remember having this conversation. I met with the family on a weekend. It was a Sunday. There was a policy in front of me. They would not let me make funeral arrangements with this family, or at least set a date. We could do everything else, but we just couldn't set a date with everything until I spoke with the insurance company the next day, because they wanted to make sure that the policy was there wasn't a loan against it, or it was, I mean, it was beyond the 2-year contestability. I mean, I could certainly see that from the policy, but they wanted to make sure that it was good before they would ever do that. That was 10 years ago. The difference now is family-owned funeral homes are insisting on that too. So, it's just the way of the business.
Yeah, so it's fair to say contestability does matter, but how quickly the funds are distributed from the insurance company, does that matter as much if you can run it through an assignment company and get paid quickly?
Well, the
Or do you
assignment,
even need to get paid quickly? Like if the funeral home knows they'll get paid eventually from,
yeah, they don't care. I mean, most funeral homes have a policy of, I don't need to be paid by the day of the funeral. I just need to know where the money's coming from.
okay.
So, so if there's a policy and they know
And
of,
when?
yeah, and they know most insurance policies, they're going to pay within 30 days. Many are much faster than that now. So, but any funeral director you'd be surprised how many well, maybe you wouldn't. There's a lot of funeral directors that don't know anything about contestability, and so they receive the policy thinking everything's fine, only to find out that things aren't fine. And so they learn a lesson real quick if they still have a job. But but the thing of it is, with that third party, to get back to your point, Chris, if they're going to take on assignment of the policy, they're going to pretty much insist that that they can talk with somebody at the insurance. I mean, there's no way they're going to take on the risk of that policy without knowing that it's in force. So there's going to be stipulations to that.
Yeah, and I'll say from the couple of I don't deal with funeral directors very often, but the couple of times that I've dealt with funeral directors, the thing that they don't seem to know more is not that it is not about contestability. It's they seem to think that every policy is contestable.
Oh, wow.
I've run into that much more often, where a person brings a 4 or 5 year old policy to a funeral director, and they say, "Well, we got to wait to make sure the investigation happens."
Right.
And that
They just don't. Yeah, they don't have
They
any
don't.
idea.
Yeah. All right, so back to some of the questions that we've gotten asked. There's a couple of longer multi-part questions, and some of them have things that we've actually already covered. So I'm going to kind of break them down. But Jason Shepard on Facebook had a couple of questions that all kind of pull in together. The big one seems to be, how hard is it to get out of a pre-need contract once you've signed it? Like if somebody signs a pre-need contract and then a few months down the road they change their mind, what happens to them? Can they get out of it? Can they get their money back? What do we as agents need to know in that scenario when we see somebody with 6 months old contract?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, they're not. I'll put it to you this way, they're not going to get money back, but because most pre-arrangements have built into them an irrevocable assignment. So the only forfeiture option is going to be reduced paid up option. So if somebody's paid into a policy for however long, preferably, a few months, and then you meet with them and, well, I just talked with Miller Funeral Home 2 months ago and I'm doing a pre-need. Oh, no problem. All you have to do is stop paying for the policy. It's going to reduce to a small little policy, which is fine. That policy will be there for you at the time of death. But what we really need to do is get you plugged into a policy that's going to not only pay the funeral, but it's also going to pay for some of these other expenses that the funeral home just is not prepared to take care of. So they're not going to get cash back, but there will be an RPU option for that.
So if, for example, you run into somebody who's paying $130, $140 a month for a pre-need plan that's already in place and they've had it for a few years, and maybe they've got $3,000 already paid into it, you can, and it's a, let's say, $6,000 plan, you can offer them $15,000 of final expense for the same premium amount, and they'll still get to keep the $3,000 they've already paid into their pre-need.
Correct. Yeah. So they'll do the calculation. They'll figure out what single premium those premiums would have purchased, right? So just like any other policy. Now the only hiccup to that is the funeral home does not have to honor the price of the funeral at that point because it's not paid in full. That's a big deal for some people. But really, when you do the math, getting up just a bigger final expense policy is going to pretty much quell that. So it shouldn't be an issue. You probably don't even need to get into that. But if somebody presses you on it, ethically, you need to let them know that the price wouldn't be guaranteed at that point.
I didn't get my point across earlier. I guess my confusion was the difference between these big long finance plans I see where they're taking a 36-month finance agreement, or something from homesteaders or NGL or what have you. Those insurance companies are selling pre-needs. What do you officially call those other things?
I mean, glorified used car contracts, pretty much.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, pretty much. I mean, they're very similar to, say, like fitness company, fitness places. Allegedly, I've never walked into one myself, but.
But why would somebody sell one of these glorified used car contracts versus a pre-need? Is that the cemetery selling that? Is that someone that's not licensed to do pre-need?
Yes, that's exactly right. So primarily, cemeteries typically tend to be way more aggressive than funeral homes because they're turning people over like crazy. And so you have these people that are, work there 3 months and that kind of thing. But yes, the contracts, since they're not licensed people, they have to treat the contracts more like just a finance purchase contract as opposed to a pre-need.
Interesting. It's good information.
And we got time for about one more question. And I'm sorry, guys, I have a hard stop that I have to do. I got some stuff I'm waiting on. So Nick, if you can give us one more good question that we can squeeze out of all the, because just so everybody knows, we're getting a ton of value and a ton of knowledge from Kevin taking the time to do this for us. We really appreciate your time, man.
No problem.
So, and we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions because there are a bunch, but I'll post some of the other questions into the YouTube comments. And if Kevin, you get a second over the course of the next week, once everything posts up, if you're able to, and you can post responses, that would be great.
Yeah.
And other people, please post more questions in the comments. We're going to be around. We'll answer questions. Email us the questions to the insurancepanel@gmail.com.
And I'm sure we'll have Kevin on for another video at a different time because this is awesome.
Yeah, and it's a ton of stuff people don't know and that they need to know, and it really is helpful if you even if you never use it, just to have this stuff working in the back of your head when you're talking to some people. It's good. It's good to go around. Let's see real quick. Let's try and see something that we haven't kind of covered. Kevin, what happens if a funeral home that the pre-need plan gets purchased from gets bought out or goes out of business? What happens to that plan?
Sure. That's actually a great question. So what happens in that situation is that's why the law in most states require that the money is being held by a third party, which is in this case the trust or the insurance company. So, I mean, more than likely that new funeral home should honor the old contract, because that's part of when you buy that business, you kind of buy into that.
Mhm.
So most of the time they would do that. If for some reason the funeral home just closes, that's fine. You still have your money. It's in that insurance product, and you just go to another funeral home, say, hey, I got a pre-arrangement with, Homesteaders and, ABC Funeral Home closed. Can I transfer the pre-arrangement to you? Of course, XYZ Funeral Home is happy to have it. And by the way, they're going to honor you the old prices because they want your business, not because they legally have to, but because they want the business.
So kind of the same first question is basically it's a huge lump sum of money and we're willing to take it because it's business for us.
It doesn't go away though. Just because the funeral home goes out of business, it's not like that money's disappeared.
That's the whole reason. Because see, before they and the funeral rule kind of addressed actually a lot of that too. So before that, you could use that money on anything. You walk in the funeral and pay them directly. Actually, they'd buy new carpet and a limo and all this stuff. No joke. I mean, it wasn't regulated at all. And so then when that person died, you're like, we got to come up with, we got to pay for the casket and all these things that the funeral home had to write checks for. And then it became an issue. So that's why the regulation is in existence, to protect the consumer.
So you mentioned the funeral rule, and I know we had a question about that, so I'm going to sneak it in here on Matt because I know he's got to leave. But real quickly, what is the funeral rule that you're talking about? The FTC funeral rule.
Yeah. So it was done. I'm going off mortuary school memory here. I believe it was in '84, where it was a rule that was devised that basically standardized the way funeral homes operated. So they had to have a general price list, which is a list of all the separate prices that you have at the funeral homes, and a vault price list, and also a casket price list. And there's certain, they lay out specific things that the lists have to have. And you would think that's like, duh. Like, of course you should have that. I mean, you go to an oil change place, all the prices are right on the wall. Well, how is this any different? We're changing grandma's oil. Why we can't figure out how much this is going to cost? Well, the issue was back in the day, it used to be you'd walk in, they say, oh yeah, burial costs $7,000. Well, you had no idea what that included. And so there was no fair way to compare things from one funeral home to another. So that's why the funeral rule came into place, to have sort of a standardized way to have your pricing so you can compare from one funeral home to another. Not to say that you couldn't package, you could, but you had to have the itemized pricing as well, so there was a fair way to compare from funeral home A to funeral home B.
Interesting.
Very good.
That's a
Was
ton
that
of information in an hour's time. That's good stuff.
Yeah, the hour went by very, very, very quickly. I am the first to say between the three members of the insurance panel that we would love to have Kevin back on a different day to go over some more questions, because it seems like there's an abundance of questions that FE agents do not know about. Well, what do you guys think?
I probably come up with 10 more during this.
Yeah. So Kevin, if you are more than welcome to come back very soon or later. I know you got a very busy schedule. We had a hard time getting you on. We were lucky to actually catch you today at the right time, but before you're like, sorry guys, I can't do it because I'm packed like sardines. So we really appreciate you taking the time to get some clarity in the market for pre-need agents or final expense agents or funeral directors, mainly for FE agents, because this is kind of what the insurance panel is based around. So I'm sure you brought a lot of clarity to the marketplace for FE agents, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
No problem. Happy to help.
Yeah, man. Well, guys, this has been another rendition of the insurance panel. If you haven't, go ahead and like, comment, subscribe. I'm Matthew Murray. We got Nick Frumpkin somewhere over there. We got Kevin Mason below me, and then we got Chris, who's going to give us the outro, which he's so well known for. Chris, give us what you got. You got to put 4 guys instead of 3 now.
Absolutely. So this is just 4 guys on a Sunday afternoon representing 4 different organizations, just sharing their thoughts on a particular topic. It doesn't represent any particular company that we're contracted with, any marketing organization we are contracted with. It's just our opinion on a particular topic, hopefully provided you some value. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and come back to the next one.
All right. Thanks,
Absolutely.
guys. See you next time.
Thanks, guys. Y'all be good.
Thanks.